what does it mean to like live in this intersection of Blackness and disability? How are like Black folks with disabilities treated differently than like white people? And why is it necessary to like name this intersection and like uplift these experiences, you know? Especially, you know, like as we're seeing now with like talking about abolition and talking about like police brutality and talking about these things, just like it is necessary to make sure that disabled folks, and specifically Black disabled folks, are part of that conversation.
So welcome to the Tea On, where we sip tea and we talk about things. I have my tea right here. It's okay if you don't have tea, girl. Preferably things that matter, honestly. And honestly, if there's any conversation that I think really, really, really matters, it's the one that we're going to have today. And I'm so excited that the face that I'm having this conversation with today is this beautiful lady's Miss Teighlor McGee. You are a poet, you are just an artist in all forms, but above all else, you are the driving force behind Black Disability Collective, which is it's playing such a divine role right now in our community, and I can't thank you enough. And I'm gonna let you introduce yourself, but I truly want to just right off the bat say thank you for what you're doing with this collective, because it's bringing a lot of awareness to something that really needs as many eyes on it as possible, and hopefully we'll drive some more eyes on it today. But yes, tell the world about yourself, Queen.
Yeah, so my name is Teighlor. I'm 22. I live in Minneapolis, and I'm creator of the Black Disability Collective, which is an online platform about bringing visibility and awareness and creating narratives surrounding Black disabled lives. Myself, I am a poet, I'm an artist, and I am a digital organizer. So I bring all those things to the table in my work. So I do Black Disability Collective, and then I also work for the organization Women for Political Change as their Young Women's Initiative coordinator. So like through like all the work that I do a lot of organizing specifically around the intersection of like Blackness and disability, because like when I got really involved in a lot of like online and digital activism, I was very much involved in like there's a very large online autism community, and so I kind of like got into this work where I was starting to get tagged on like lists of like Black autistic voices, and I was like, cool, you know. But that started happening because there was like this huge disparity online of like the folks who are most visible in that community. And as someone really cool, like is a disabled person, and I represent like, because I have like physical disabilities, like I have a gastrointestinal disease, and so for me, it's like I wanted to do work that went beyond just the spectrum of like just like autism advocacy, you know what I mean? And so I was very much seeing that like there was like obviously a lot of really great voices doing some like work about like Blackness and disability, but there is still this very large gap where it's just like when you think of disability, like the vast majority of like folks you see online or you see doing that advocacy work is white people. And so a lot of Black folks also honestly live with disabilities and might not realize that their experiences are disabilities, like folks with like diabetes, folks with like high blood pressure, things like that, like certain things that directly impact the Black community a little more. But a lot of folks don't necessarily consider themselves disabled, you know? And so a part of this work is kind of educating people on like what does like disability mean, and like disability as kind of like a very political identity, and like kind of like crafting these narratives about like what does it mean to like live in this intersection of Blackness and disability? How are like Black folks with disabilities treated differently than like white people, and why is it necessary to like name this intersection and like uplift these experiences, you know? Especially, you know, like as we're seeing now with like talking about abolition and talking about like police brutality and talking about these things, just like it is necessary to make sure that disabled folks, and specifically Black disabled folks, are part of that conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's why having your face be on the front lines is so important, because you yourself, you represent that intersection, right? Which is what we're going to get into. But the point that you bring up about the fact that like right now is an imperative time to have this conversation is directly linked with police brutality, because a lot of people don't know this, but I think it's about like from 1/3 to I think an entire half of cases of police brutality are against people that are Black and that are disabled, the Black disabled community. And I read something, and I guess I'll read it now, because when I read it, it was like so impactful to me. But it says the danger for people with mental illnesses and other disabilities is bred from the issue of compliance culture, right? So all of these instances with police brutality, 9 times out of 10, they're triggered by the issue that police, once they feel like they're not seeing compliance in a way that they want to, it's their sort of like notion to do what they do. And with people with disabilities, oftentimes there's gap, you know, whether they cannot hear, there's things without their control that they cannot control. That's where we're seeing the statistics skyrocket. And so I think above all else, of course, abolition would be a huge way to eradicate this issue, but I think also it's just a matter of talking about it and raising awareness, right? So hopefully that's what we'll do today. And like I told you before, usually in these conversations, I participate a bit more, but I think today I really just want to learn. And first and foremost, I'd love, because you are a person not only who's doing so much work, but that you had this experience, you know, being in the intersection, you know, being Black, being a woman, being just disabled. What has your experience been so far that you think is worth people knowing about?
I think that people don't always like realize the ways in which they have internalized respectability politics and how that comes forth in the way they interact with specifically Black disabled people. I think that people have these ideas in their head and that live in their body about like what's acceptable about how to interact with folks. Right. But like I always say something that I think is pretty radical to a lot of people, that I think the idea of like politeness and rudeness is a social construct. I don't think those are real things. Right. I think that those are inherently rooted in a lot of ancient patriarchal, like, you know, like racist ideas, because oftentimes, you know, white people think Black people are rude because of the way we communicate, you know what I'm saying? But then Black people think autistic people are rude because of the way we communicate, and it's just like this ongoing cycle, you know what I mean? Right. So I think I really want people to understand that like living this intersection means like I am very hyper aware of the way in which people read me. And it's like a lot of like white people are uncomfortable by how like loud I am, or like how much space I vary, and I very intentionally took a lot of space, you know, because it's just like that's my communication style. That's how I interact with the world, and they're very uncomfortable by that. And that discomfort is rooted in anti-Blackness, of course. But then when it's like I interact in the same way with like Black folks, and if like those Black folks feel uncomfortable, that's rooted in like that ableism, where it's like, oh, well, you know, like the way you're like speaking, or like the way you're like, you know, interacting with folks is just like, that's like rude to me. It's just like rudeness and politeness are not like real concepts, you know? It's just like, also a lot of those things are rooted in very like Western ideas, you know what I mean? It's just like, we're all over the world, like our communication styles and our communities are very different, you know? Like within the autistic community, it's a lot more acceptable to kind of like interrupt people when you talk, you know? Because when I interact with the other autistic folks, we kind of like interrupt. And like in our community, that's very like, that's expected, you know, it's fine, that's how we communicate. Whereas if you interrupt like other Black people, sometimes they really take it some kind of way, you know what I'm saying? So it's like, for like my interaction, a lot of it is just like, for my experiences, it's a lot of like those direct interactions with people, just like being very hyper aware how they read me, you know, just because like folks don't even like realize they do this, you know what I mean? It's like these ideas are so like deeply rooted, you know? But like that's like a very like good example of just like what this intersection is like, where it's just like within like these certain communities, like people like have like really internalized these ideas, and it leads them kind of like interacting with folks in a way that's not really fair, you know? So it's just like, I definitely oftentimes feel like people don't necessarily always want to give me opportunities to like speak or like on behalf of things, or like do those type of things, because they don't necessarily love the way I communicate. And it's like, that's a personal problem, you know? It's just like everyone has different communication styles, and people don't realize like those little things like rooted in like ableism or stuff, or like specifically like I have like really like picky eating. That's a very like common like autistic thing. A lot of folks just like are super picky eaters, and I get so mad because people online, especially a lot of Black people, will make fun of like, oh, you know, if you're a picky eater or whatever, and people don't realize that's like a very like, you know, that's ableism still, you know what I mean? So a lot of these things I experience are like very just like are things that I am very aware people don't realize are ableist. That's one of the reasons why I use my platform the way that I do, to be like, hey, you might not know this, so I'm not gonna like come for you if you don't know this, but it's like I want to educate you on like why these things that you've internalized are actually rooted in ableism and aren't okay. You know?
Absolutely. And I'm so excited to like later go on my own and like dissect this concept that you brought to me, because the idea of like rudeness and politeness being a construct, I think that's really, really powerful actually. And just like within my own like spiritual journey, like completely separate from this, I've really been battling with the idea of like disconnecting from duality. You know, I think, you know, like what is bad and what is good, and simply accepting things for what they are, a foreign concept. And I think that falls right in line with it. So I
agree. People want to like label things as being inherently good or inherently bad, or want to strive towards them being like goodness or badness. And like those that spectrum is a spectrum, you know what I mean? It's not just like a black and white type thing, you know?
Absolutely, everything's a spectrum, totally. And you know what you're saying about feeling, I guess, an ounce of like judgment in either community, being the forefront of such a powerful platform right now, have you been able to, I don't know, find more spaces where you feel more understood and more seen and more comfortable? Have you like been connecting with other members?
Yeah, definitely. That's like the reason why I really created like the Blind Disability Collective, just to like, because my whole motivation for this has been like community work and community building. Like, it's really not about like, I don't know, people always ask me, like, you're gonna like become like a nonprofit, are you gonna do these things? It's just like, I'm not really interested in the nonprofit industrial complex. That's like a means that I have to use to like accomplish what I need to do. I'm okay going down that avenue, but at the end of the day, I just want to build community spaces. And because of like access needs are so different, like we have this concept of like conflicting access needs, where some folks might need one thing and that conflicts with what another person needs. You know what I mean? And so because of those things, like organizing digitally is a lot better for disabled folks because it helps like address some of like the conflicting access need problems that exist with like physical meeting up, especially, you know, in this era where like a lot of folks are kind of like all spread out, you know what I mean? It's like there's not like one specific like hub where all of the Black disabled people live here, you know what I mean? And so in order to like talk about these things and experiences, I created like our like private Facebook group is just for like Black disabled folks to like have like a space to just like be like, this is what I'm experiencing today, and folks will come there and like talk about a wide range of things, like, oh, I'm looking to get a service dog, and then people could like ask experience about that, or like, oh, like, have you had any experience with like this like medical treatment, or are you living, or like, do you live like cerebral palsy, or different like people with different like diseases or different like things will like post in there, kind of be like trying to find other folks who are living in that intersection as well. Because, you know, what I realized is just like, I can't speak for every Black disabled person, because like if you're someone living with like cerebral palsy, or you're living with, or you're deaf, or, you know, those are like completely different like, you know, communities and like cultures, and I want those to exist, but I also want to be able to create a space where like folks can find each other in that way, you know what I mean? And like, so I kind of want to be like the incubator for that, where it's just like, okay, you can connect, and if you're having like a really like horrible day, or like you're having a bad symptom day, or like a bad flare day, or you need some like advice, or you want just like some like words of support, there's a space for you to like go to do that. Like at the end of the day, that's what matters like the most to me, is the existence and like the creation of that space. Because like all the other social medias like Twitter and like Instagram is like, I do a lot more education for like allies, for folks who like the narrative building, and for like folks who might understand like this like life and this like work and everything like that. But like for like the Facebook group, it's just like that private space just for like us, you know? So I try to like think of this work in those like two camps, where it's like, here's like the community space, and then here's like the more like education like sphere for like folks who like might not like know about like the Black disabled experience, to kind of like observe, you know, or like ask questions. And like I try to be the person to like do more of the education work as like a lighter skinned like Black person, you know what I mean? Like I feel more comfortable taking on the level of like labor than some other folks, so it's just like I try to position myself to be able to do that in that way.
Totally. And I think there's so much value in either side of it. I think having that community for you guys is huge for your mental health above all else. I think community right now is something that we really need. And as far as education, I think you're doing an incredible job. If there was any, well, and we'll get to maybe specifically one, but I think maybe right now we can just list maybe some like stigmas and some common misconceptions of the community that you think maybe more able-bodied people and just the general public and media should know. Because I think you've already tapped on a few, which is the idea of like, there's this sort of like one-dimensional narrative of like what disability looks like, when in reality there's so many more layers to it, right? What are more like misconceptions that you think we should break?
I think that there's a lot of misconceptions about what disability looks like, because there are people who are like, you know, you can have more invisible disabilities, you know, like a lot of like what I deal with is considered more like a visible disability, because like people don't physically like see that. There's a lot of stigma around folks who like, you know, like who like people like will like snap videos or like pictures of people who are like blind and they're like using a phone, or like a deaf person with like headphones in, like things like that, where just like people actually understand that like the wide spectrum of experiences that exist within different disabilities. So it's like, yes, blind people can use cell phones. Yes, deaf people can use headphones. A lot of people might be deaf in one ear, you know? Like people who aren't full-time wheelchair users, they might use a wheelchair when they're having like, you know, like more pain, but not on other days. And so that's like a big thing, where just like people like really want to have a very cookie cutter image of disability, and they want it to be like a white person in a wheelchair, like a little like handicap like symbol outside the store, you know? Not And the thing is, like, I've heard really a lot of horror stories from folks in life, but it just happens to a lot of like Black women. Where like I know a lot of women with like lupus, right? Who will have like kind of like disability placards for like parking and stuff. And white people will like harass them and like, why are you parking there? Like you're not disabled, whatever. Like a lot of folks with more invisible disabilities will get harassed when they try to park in like disability parking spots. People just like, well, you're not disabled. And so a lot of just like the misconceptions leading to like non-disabled people trying to like gatekeep and trying to like harass people who are actually disabled because like they're not fitting into like the image they created in their head of disabilities. And then alongside that, a lot of times like this is like inherent desire to infantilize disabled people. I see it a lot like when like the autistic community, because it's such a spectrum of just like what your autism experience is like for you. It's so individual and so different, you know? So there are people who have like higher access needs than others. And that's totally fine. You know, like when we talk about like advocacy to the community, it's just like there are people who are verbal and non-verbal. There are people who have like more needs than others. And it's just like that's still like one community, you know? And it's just like you really like across the board can't make assumptions about like what someone needs, you know? It's like people, I feel like, don't always ask questions. Like it's like if you have like if you know someone is disabled or like you make a friend who's disabled, you should just ask like what are your access needs. It should be simple as being able to just say that, like what are your access needs. So it's just because ignoring it doesn't help, you know what I mean? It's like I have friends who like folks that ignore their access needs, like take them to the mall or take them somewhere where they can't walk a long period of time, and it puts that person in a position to kind of be like, oh well, now I have to like awkwardly kind of be like, hey, like this is like not good for me or whatever. Or people are just like overly helping, right? Just like overly just like doing the most, doing too much in a way that feels just really just like you're like really overstepping people's boundaries, you know? And so like both of those are bad, you know what I mean? So folks really need to normalize. You need to ask someone, what are your access needs? And honestly, people should be asking that beyond just within the spectrum of disability. You should be asking all of your friends that, you know, because like that applies to mental health, that applies to physical health, that applies to like everything. It's just like, what are your access needs? Like, how can I make this space that I want to occupy with you a safe place for you to, you know, be comfortable, be yourself, exist, you know? And I really want to talk about that and have people like normalize that idea, you know? It's just like, because if you start asking them with your friends who are just like more able to, or just like your friends who deal with like mental illness or something, then you already have practiced that. So when you encounter more disabled folks, you already have that practice like going within your community, within like the spaces you occupy, you know?
What a beautiful, beautiful point for you to bring up, because that truly does bleed into any sort of that's just human compassion. It's like just being aware of like the people around you and what they need. And I think at times we tend to stay within our comfort zone, and we think that ignoring it is how we're supposed to approach it. But I think that also derives from the idea that like this is a conversation that hasn't been had on a public scale enough, right? Because it's still something that's like uncomfortable or hasn't been touched enough. People don't really know how to approach it. So I think having conversations like this is really going to help. And I think also, and I'm curious to know, I had this written down to ask you, what arenas do you think that there should be more representation of the disabled community in general, and especially the Black disabled community? Because, you know, I wonder, there's such an importance that lies in being able to turn on the TV or open a magazine and see somebody that you identify with or see something that you can connect to. And that's been something that a lot of different communities have had hurdles in. But I especially, you know, couldn't imagine what that hurdle must be on in this specific community. You know, did you grow up having somebody that you felt like that represented you and what you were going through at all? Or I would assume no, right?
Yeah, not really. What I particularly want to see, I feel like a lot of folks who might have different politics than me would answer that and want to see like more like CEOs and more politicians.
Right.
I don't subscribe to that. That's not me. I don't think that helps anyone. I want to see more like folks like as doctors, you know, as like nurses, really in the medical field, because like one of the biggest issues in our community is just like just constantly feeling like people do not listen to us. People do not like advocate for us when we are like at the doctor's office, when we are, you know, like going through these things we're experiencing. We experience a lot of like gaslighting, a lot of like harm. And even it's like, you look at like, you know, the statistics of like the Black women who die in childbirth, you know what I mean? That all of those things are rooted in like systematic like medical like racism. And like that intersects with like disability justice like so hard, you know, because just like Black disabled people, it's like the hospitals are not a safe place for you, you know? And so it's just like, I feel like addressing that would be more Black like doctors and nurses and like higher up like specialists, like doctors like specialists and like folks who are doing research. Because when we think about all this research, we look at like, you know, the violent history, like gynecology, the violent history of like, you know, the syphilis and like all these things that were tested on Black bodies. It's like we need like medical procedures tested on Black people, but in an ethical and like honest way. Because like, you know, like just that's why so many of these treatments, so many of these things like don't work on Black people, because they weren't researched or tested or thought of with like Black people and Black bodies and Black experiences in mind. And so in order for us to like really long-term improve like our quality of life, like that needs to be something like addressed. But it's like that also can't be addressed until like the barriers that exist for like Black people like getting that level of education are dismantled as well. Because like educational systems gatekeep where it's like if you're sick and like colleges, they don't want to accommodate you, you know, and they don't want to accommodate you with like in medical school and things like that, you know. And so it's like we need those barriers broken down so we can have Black disabled folks in those positions of like research, in like hospitals, in like those facilities, and then higher up in like academia in order to like, you know, stop that level of like racism and ableism as well, you know. Like that's what I see as like being like a place that there could be like very like, you know, intentional change. But it's like it would have to be like, you know, dismantling those things, that those systems in place that are like keeping us out intentionally, because it's intentional, you know.
100%. Yeah, and I think that that's huge. I think of course there's value in seeing those faces, you know, in the media and stuff, but like if you don't feel safe in spaces where you go for help in like the most dire way, you know, imagine how much suffering that could give you. So yeah, 100%. I think that that's huge. And
I wanted to like give that answer too, because like I really like, for my own self, I'm really trying to work to intentionally dismantle like Black exceptionalism.
Yeah.
And I think that as we like see everything happening with like police brutality and like protests, like with people like dying, people's lives being stolen, a lot of it is like we fall into these narratives of like Black exceptionalism, like, oh, this person, you know, was like how like Breonna Taylor was like an EMT, like, oh, like she was like doing like a really important job, you know. It's just like Black people don't have to be exceptional in order to deserve to live, you know. And so I also just like always want to like push back on that idea, because when we fall into that narrative, it's like furthers white supremacy, you know. It furthers this idea that like, you know, and these ideas of like very capitalist like mentality where it's just like you need to be like productive in order to like be allowed to live, and that's just not how it should be. Like any like person's life should be able to like exist without having to like contribute to the economy, without having to like have like an important job, without having to have that level of like visibility. Like people should be able to exist, you know.
People should be able to exist.
Yeah, so it's just like I want there to be Black people in like media and on shows. Like I think we deserve to be like, and like Black people, you know, I think we deserve to be reflected in that way. Yeah. But at the same time, it's like we also have to like think of like these other systems as well.
100,000,000%. What a beautiful point to bring up, especially like, you know, obviously like Elijah's story really emotionally impacted me, as they all have. But like there was this narrative that everyone was pushing, including me, of like he was such a good person, he did not deserve this. But it's like he didn't need to be a saint to have deserved to make it home that night. You know what I mean? And so yeah, I understand fully what you mean. And even riding on the wave of police brutality, and the fact that you mentioned that you live in Minneapolis, so I'm sure the energy there and your experience and the tension. So I guess we could talk about that, because I mean that's there's so much to unpack, but I mean the statistics are there. I mean obviously the police brutality against this community has been an overwhelming amount, and it's something that I like just mentally cannot comprehend, but also at this point, you know, what else is there to expect? But within the own police community, I think it's very clear what needs to happen there. But as far as like otherwise, what do you think we need to do? How can we step up to really help fix this narrative, and above all else, work against compliance culture, which is a concept that I never really even dove into, but now that I'm having awareness being brought to me, it makes a whole lot of sense why that's been a huge factor for it. So yeah, what can we do to like help alleviate this?
Something that I've been talking about a lot is just like we all need to be working to create intentional structures of community care. And what I mean by that is like, as we work forward to envision a police-free world, a lot of people are like, well, who are going to call it the police? And it's just like, we are right now in the process of, we have to be building these systems in place of like, how are we going to take care of one another? How are we going to build these community hubs in order for people to still be able to access what they need? Because it's just like, you can't advocate for this current system because this current system is broken. But as we like dream and envision of like what comes next is, I think it's like everyone has to like kind of find like, what is your role, and as we envision what comes next, and how are you going to like, you know, tune in and be a part of that, you know? I think it's like, we talk about these big ideas of like mutual aid is like a big one, you know? And my org, Women for Political Change, has been doing like a lot of like mutual aid work in Minneapolis, you know, for folks who like, we like offer like $200 if you're like under 30, and if you're like one of our like demographics, if you're like person of color, if you know, if you like are like experiencing these like things, you know? And so you can get this mutual aid. So it's like, people should be like, if you have the means, create mutual aid funds, you know, like creating like kind of like community like systems in place. So it's like, if folks have like a mental health like concern, like they don't have to like call the police, because the police kill people if you call them for mental health, you know? And just like, everyone is able to like play like different roles right now and what that envisioning is. And it's just like, are you, you know, holding politicians accountable? Are you like, you know, like blowing up their line and be like, what are you doing for this? Right now, Minneapolis, like, we're like really dealing with a lot of like housing problems because like post like the George Floyd protests and everything is like, there's like a sanctuary area like in a public park, and it's like folks are like asking like the state to be like, please give us money because winter is going to come, and what is going to happen to these people in this encampment? And like the state has not been providing the money, and so the city's been having to do it. And it's like these like different things. So it's just like folks have been organizing like, are you gonna like come to the camp? Are you gonna bring folks food? Are you gonna like, you know, like provide tents? Like, how are you gonna show up for like people in like these communities, you know? And so I think it's like, as people like want to know like, what do they do next, it's just like looking within your own community, whether you are like a Black person in need. It's like, okay, where are the resources for you? Where are the gaps? How can we fill those gaps? And for like white like allies, I hate the word ally. I don't really subscribe to that. But it's like, if you want to be like a white ally, it's just like, how are you like providing aid and like showing up for like Black lives now in a way that's going to be sustainable? Because just like, I think that people should be giving money directly to folks who ask for money, but it's just like, in terms of like long-term needs, like how can you like use like your white privilege to like alleviate like a lot of the concerns and like the things that are happening to like the Black community, you know what I mean? Like, think about like these like long-term wealth things that you have had access to that other folks haven't. How are you going to like work to dismantle that, you know? And so they're all like very big questions that don't have singular answers, but the biggest thing is like, people need to be talking about these things and like be in conversation with one another, you know, like, because these like issues aren't going to be solved by individualist mentalities. That's like what helps perpetuate all the harm that we keep continuing to see, as people thinking like, well, I have mine, fuck everyone else. And it's just like, white people are the ones who the most need to get out of that mentality, and Black people need to make sure they're showing up for one another and not falling into a lot of these like Black capitalist traps, you know what I mean? Where it's like, well, I want to be Jay-Z, I want to, you know, like get these like memes, and it's just like, that's not going to actually help the community long term, and like creating the systems in place necessary for us to like move beyond like policing, you know?
100%, totally, 1,000,000%. I think people need to get very, very, very clear on what role it is that they can play and how they can play that role within their own community first and foremost. I think we can get really overwhelmed with trying to dismantle and uproot something that is so large scale, but if we really break it down into where we are right now in our communities, I mean, right here in South Florida, I know there's so much that can be done. So I think if we all just pour ourselves into our community, into the people next to us, really, like you said, go to the source, like what is it that you need, and really provide. I think one by one we can sort of like build something that makes sense and walk towards that dream future that you talked about, you know, where, you know, there are community-led programs and where people who are actually equipped to deal with instances having to do with mental health issues and stuff like that can actually be the ones to be called instead of, you know.
I also like, I saw a really great graphic the other day, and something I experienced like on the personal level, just a lot of white people who are like realizing their shortcomings are kind of just kind of like, oh God, I need to like do better, I need to do better, I need to like hit up the Black people I know, I gotta hit up the Black, and it's like, yo, like I don't want you in my inbox, I don't want you blowing up my phone, like during these like stressful time, and that's not actually being helpful. So there's all this graphic that was kind of like indicating, just like asking like a Black person like, oh, like whatever you need, I can like do it. That's not helpful. It's just like, it's more helpful when you're just like I made you dinner. It's outside your door. Like, you know, if you like, you know, like I'm here for you, or just like actually physically bringing stuff to like people, like bring someone groceries, like bring someone like a meal, like bring someone like supplies, you know what I mean? Like send someone money, you know, just like very like tangible things instead of like actually just like, because it's like obviously when people like ask, but it's like a lot of times like people ask like, oh, how are you? Like, what do you need? Can feel very empty, you know? So it's just like
empty. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think a lot of I think that also falls into the category of like performative activism, which has been a thing that's skyrocketing to say the very least. So yeah, I think right now, I think we're looking for action right now. I think we're way past the point of conversation. Absolutely. And something that I saw that was on, I believe that either the Twitter or the Instagram, but you had a quote about neurodiversity.
Yeah.
And I wanted you to be able to sort of break down the meaning behind that, because when I did my own research, I thought that was something that a lot of people may not even be familiar with that term, and it's a term that's really important, I would say. So can you just tell the people a bit about what that means?
Yeah, for sure. So like neurodiversity is like, so neurodiverse folks is kind of like, so there's like neurotypical, which would be someone who like doesn't have autism or doesn't have ADHD or whatever, like a neurotypical brain, right? And then a neurodiverse brain is like a brain that's like autistic or has ADHD. And then some mental illnesses kind of fall into there, but there can be kind of like debate around that regard. And so like uplifting neurodiversity as a movement is about recognizing that like there are folks whose brains think and process and work differently. And like in our society and in like our world, it's like we value and we expect people to all function as if they have a neurotypical brain. And so the neurodiversity movement is about like the acknowledgement and like wanting people to be to understand that like there are folks who do not have neurotypical brains and who operate and think and like react to the world in a different way. And a lot of times in the autism community we talk about like there's a lot of like very abusive therapy that folks especially like use on their children called like ABA, like ABA, or like ABBA, something like that. It's like ABA. So it's like so it's like a therapy that folks use on like autistic children to make them act more like neurotypical, and it's abusive. It's like an act of violence, right? And so part of like uplifting neurodiversity is trying to get people to realize like you don't have to abuse autistic people into behaving neurotypical. Like we can create a more accessible world where we acknowledge that like not everyone's brains work the same. And so that's like kind of what that movement is all about. Just a lot of people don't realize those things, you know what I mean? They don't realize that just like there is these difference in like the way our brains function, the way our brains look, and that's totally okay, you know? But it's like so often it's just like there's so much ableism, people like wanting neurodiverse folks to act like neurotypical people, like they want to like abuse them, they want to like, you know, like condition them to like you need to act like this. And like in the community, we also refer that a lot of like as masking, you know? It's like, so when you go in different spaces, you're masked, like you're like trying to like front like you're neurotypical when you're autistic. And it takes a lot of energy. It's super exhausting. It's like a lot of like thinking and like following a lot of like social scripts, right? Really trying to like emanate how like normal people act, you know what I mean? And so like as we create this like very like neurodiversity, like positive movement, we are trying to actually like reject that idea that autistic people either have to like have like their autistic traits like abused out of them, or like consistently have to like mask and like, you know, cover their like the way they act in order for like able people and like neurotypical people to be more comfortable, you know?
Oof. Oh my gosh, what an incredible concept that I think more people need to know, because it falls right in line with this idea of like going from like trying to erase something to trying to like tolerate something to actually like not only uplifting but celebrating the difference and the diversity in the way that the community thinks and in the way that you operate, you know what I mean? I think there's to understand the concept of like trying to abuse it out of you is so, oh my gosh, caveman like, if anything. And I can't believe that's something that is still being dealt with, and honestly I'm sorry, truly.
It's so horrible that it's just like it's like on the same level as like conversion therapy. Like
exactly.
You know, like
absolutely. But I mean, you know, hopefully we'll advance past a point where that's even something that we still need to fight for. But until then, I'm glad that you're bringing so much awareness to it. And overall, I just like when I see the stuff that you post on both of your accounts and with all of your organizations, it's just like you're putting so much above all else. You put so much strength behind what it is that you do. You can tell that the passion is burning, and to see that from somebody who is dealing with everything right alongside us, who, I mean, you know, you've been really open and vulnerable about, you know, a lot of the stuff that you're going through, you know, and like when you're in the hospital too, and it's like you're doing all of this, you're fighting so hard while dealing with so much. And so just know that you are seen and that what you're doing is so purposeful and you're heard. And I'm hoping so much that the entire community is heard and is seen, because you mentioned some point in this conversation that, you know, you guys don't feel heard and you don't feel seen. And so A, if there is anything that you really feel like we need to hear, please say it. And B, you know, what is your ideal, what does the end of this fight look like for you? What change do you really, really, really want to see implemented in our society?
Yeah, so I want to see the defunding and dismantlement of police. I want to see capitalism abolished. Those are like the really big things. Like within like our current systems, like I feel like there's no way to reform them to make them so like we can all like thrive in the ways we need to thrive. So just big picture, I want those things gone, right? And then I want you to see how like uplift structures of community care. I want people to actually like be able to access what they need and have like that take precedent over all other things. Like I said, I want to like really like work to like weed out like the rampant individualism that I think plagues our world, where people think, you know, I've got mine, so you know, fuck everyone else. And it's just like, I think, you know, it's like as someone who like I came into this work doing a lot of like healthcare, like advocacy and organizing, it's just like when like the Affordable Care Act was like under attack and everything, it was very much just like debates were just like, I don't know how to make you see that you should care about other people.
Yes.
That's like the core of this is just like trying to get people like, you need to care about other people. You need to like love your neighbor like without distinction. Like you need to like actually like, you know, like be invested in like your community. It should not just be about like you and your individual needs. Like we need to like think about these things. And people always want to fight me online about this, and it's like not everybody wants to like, you know, be a part of like collectivism. And it's just like, I'm sorry if like you don't want to care about other people, but it's like you should be in the minority with that, you know? And it just like folks like feel like the individualists, the capitalists, like they're the majority, but they're not. They've just like created these systems in which other folks who share these ideas and like these hopes and these things can't vote, you know, with like incarceration. They can't vote because of like immigration. It's like there's more of us than there are of them.
Yes.
But it's literally because of the system, and like with like redlining and the redistricting, they make it so even people can't vote. They make it impossible. Like there's like, I'm from Wisconsin, and there's the voter ID laws make it so it's like, and like if you don't have like an ID, which you wouldn't if you're like you live in the inner city, it's just like you can't vote. You know what I mean? So it's like all these systematic ways like want to like, you know, skew the data and make it look like there's more of them. It's not true. You know, it's just like we outnumber them in regards to just like, you know, everyday people who want to care about our communities, who want our neighbors and our friends to have access to like their needs, and like want people to have homes and be safe, you know? So it's just like long term, I want those like big horrible things like dismantled so that folks are able to eat and have somewhere to sleep and like have a home and like have what they need. And just like I just don't believe that politicians can save us, or like we can like thrive under capitalism or anything like that. And I know those things sound like so like radical, but it's just like honestly just like these systems that we know have like, you know, been built off of, you know, stolen land and slave labor. It's like, what do you do with that? You know, give the land back and let's, you know, actually like, you know, like create something sustainable rooted in the community instead of in, you know, lining like Wall Street pockets, you know? It's just like, and like my big like long-term dreams, that's what I want.
100%. I mean, I think first of all, I've seen so many people like recently just like apologize for, or sort of prefacing their radical beliefs with saying, you know, my bad that this is, and just like, no, if there's any point in time where we need the most radical voices, it's right now. I think it's the safest time to be loudly and boldly radical. And I mean, there's so many different fights that are going on right now. And I keep saying the underlying thread of all of them is that like, how do you teach people to be empathetic? How can I convince you that other people are worthy of being cared about? But what you said is so true. I think we are the majority, right? I think it can often seem the opposite because of the fact that there's so many systems and that our society protects those who do think individualistically. But no, I think there's enough people fighting this fight, and I'm inherently optimistic, but I do think that we are walking towards the change that we want to see, by embodying the change that we want to see, by having these conversations, by uplifting each other, and by people like you who are just really stepping so boldly in your purpose. And I know you were nominated, right, for I believe it was like the disability impact list, and I just oh my God, you are so deserving of it, truly. I mean, the work that you're doing.
Trust, I get it, you know.
Yes, no, of course, absolutely, and hopefully this will, you know, bring more eyes to you. But yeah, if you ever feel, I'm not assuming that you do, but if you ever do feel like overwhelmed by this all, or like, you know, you're sort of like screaming at a wall, then know that, you know, you have so much support and so much love behind you. And like I said, what you're doing is so purposeful and so much bigger than yourself. And that's the most important thing that I think a person can do, is really follow their soul's mission. So what can we expect from you? Is there anything that you want to know? Any place you want to drive people to visit or donate or anything?
Yeah, folks can definitely like follow along on Instagram at Black Disability Collective, or on Twitter at Black Disability. If folks want to like donate, they can donate to Women for Political Change, because like that will fund like the mutual aid fund for folks in Minneapolis who are in need. So like that's like a super important thing to fund. Going forward, I'm hoping to launch the Black Disability like Patreon soon, so like more context will come. I'm really excited. And a lot of folks on the account have been like urging me, because like since I do poetry, I did like a poetry live like once, and people were like, oh, we want to see more of that. So I'm hoping to like do more of that content soon, since people are expressing interest and like engaging with more of my art, which is like pretty cool. So like
totally. Oh, I love your tattoo, by the way. I just saw it. This one is so
a little moon thing.
We love a good moon moment. I will 100% be on the lookout for all of those things. I think you are so well with your words that I can imagine like seeing your poetry, truly. But thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for you guys watching. If any of this conversation made you uncomfortable, then you need to be uncomfortable. We're at the point where we need to be out of our comfort zones, queen.
Yep.
So yeah, so listen up and please play your part and play your role. But you know that there's always light at the end of the tunnel, and that we are actively building the life that we deserve to live. So thank you, Teighlor. And yes, that is all.